Something buried deep inside a stack of legal documents has just detonated inside the British royal family. And the people closest to the palace are not pretending otherwise. Official documentation prepared by Prince Edward's legal team has confirmed in writing what royal observers had long suspected but never seen formally stated. Edward is holding two titles at the same time. Two titles operating under two completely different legal systems. Two titles that were always going to collide. And now that the lawyers have written it all down in black and white, what that collision actually means for Edward's son James has become impossible for the palace to keep quiet any longer. James is 18 years old. He grew up inside one of the most complex webs of royal expectation and institutional silence in modern British history. And what these documents have now confirmed is that the structure surrounding his father's titles was not designed with James in mind. It was designed around him. It was designed to move past him entirely. The palace did not stumble into this situation accidentally. Every layer of it was deliberate, legally constructed, and signed off at the highest level. What Edward's lawyers have now confirmed is the precise mechanism by which his son was written out of his grandfather's legacy before he was old enough to have any say in the matter. To understand why this has sent shockwaves through royal circles, you need to understand what these two titles actually are, how they work, and why the specific legal structure King Charles chose when he granted one of them is the entire problem. Before any of this makes sense, you have to go back to the beginning. Because the story of how Prince Edward arrived at this precise moment, sitting at the center of a royal title crisis, is inseparable from the story of a man who spent decades being underestimated, mocked, and quietly written off by the institution he served. In February 1987, Edward walked away from Royal Marines training after just 4 months. He was 22 years old. His father, Prince Philip, had served in the Royal Navy during the Second World War and had built his entire public identity around service, endurance, and discipline. Philip did not take his youngest son's decision quietly. People close to the family described him as genuinely furious. Edward had quit in full public view, and the British press treated it as an invitation. They accepted with enthusiasm. While his brothers had compiled respectable military records, Charles in the RAF and Royal Navy, Andrew flying combat helicopters in the Falklands War under live fire, Edward had lasted 4 months and walked off the base. That image followed him for years, and it never fully disappeared. He drifted for a while after that. He found his way into the theater world, taking a position with Andrew Lloyd Webber's production company before eventually launching his own television production venture, Ardent Productions, in 1996. The palace was uncomfortable. The press found the whole thing endlessly amusing. But Edward pressed forward, and for several years Ardent operated in the background producing documentaries with a royal focus. Then in 2001, Ardent sent a film crew to St. Andrews University. Prince William had just arrived for his first term. The palace had spent months carefully negotiating a media protection agreement with every major British press organization. The terms were clear. Leave William alone. Let the future king experience university life without cameras hunting him across campus. Every major outlet had agreed and honored it. Ardent broke it. They filmed William walking across the St. Andrews campus and intended to use that footage for commercial documentary content. When the palace found out, the response was somewhere between disbelief and fury. Edward was forced to issue a public apology. Ardent Productions closed shortly after. His television career was finished. And through all of this, the tabloids had spent more than a decade running relentless speculation about Edward's personal life, his unmarried status into his mid-30s, his career in entertainment, and what both supposedly signaled. In 1995, the News of the World went further than speculation and published a direct claim based on a named source. Edward said nothing. Not then, not afterward. He absorbed it in silence because engaging with it would only have amplified it. By the time he married Sophie Rhys-Jones in June 1999, Edward had been publicly dismantled so many times that what happened next barely registered as unusual to anyone outside the tightest royal circles. On their wedding day, everyone expected a dukedom. That was how it worked. Charles had been made Duke of Cornwall, Andrew had received the Duke of York. Edward was next in line, and the title was considered automatic. Instead, the palace announced he would be Earl of Wessex. An earldom. A step down in status from what any senior royal male had received at marriage in living memory. The reported reasoning was that Edward and Sophie wanted a lower profile, But the palace attached something to that announcement that was supposed to compensate for the unexpected reduction. Buckingham Palace publicly confirmed that Queen Elizabeth, Prince Philip, and Prince Charles had all agreed that Edward would receive the Dukedom of Edinburgh in due course. Philip's own title, one of the most historic in the entire royal structure, not immediately, but eventually. The promise was made publicly. Philip had staked his own name on it. That promise would wait 24 years to be kept, and when it finally was, it came with a condition that changed everything. When Edward became Duke of Edinburgh on his 59th birthday, the 10th of March 2023, most of the public heard one thing. The promise had been kept. Edward finally had his father's title. What almost no one initially noticed were two words buried inside the legal structure of the grant. Life peerage. A life peerage is held by one person and ends when that person dies. It does not pass to children. It does not travel down the family line. When Edward dies, the Dukedom of Edinburgh will not go to James. It will return to the crown, cease to exist in its current form, and can only be recreated if a future monarch chooses to do so. As confirmed by verified peerage records and multiple royal sources, the fourth creation of this title was explicitly structured as a life peerage, meaning Edward's son James will not inherit the dukedom, unlike Edward's other hereditary peerages. But here is where the double title comes in and why what Edward's lawyers have now formally documented matters so much. Edward does not hold just one title. He holds two simultaneously, and they operate under completely different legal rules. The Dukedom of Edinburgh, granted in 2023, is a life peerage. It ends with Edward. But the Earldom of Wessex, which Edward has held since 1999, is a hereditary peerage. It does not end with Edward. According to verified peerage records, when Edward eventually dies, James will formally inherit the substantive title of Earl of Wessex, along with the Earl of Forfar and Viscount Severn. The dukedom collapses back to the crown. The earldom passes to James. One door slams shut. Another opens. Both events are triggered by the same moment, Edward's death. That simultaneous exchange is the switch. That is precisely what Edward's lawyers have now formally confirmed in official documentation. Two titles. Two legal systems. Two completely different destinies. And the documentation confirming this structure is what has brought the quiet truth of James's situation into plain sight. James Alexander Philip Theo Mountbatten Windsor, now Earl of Wessex by courtesy, was born on the 17th of December 2007 and turned 18 in December 2025. He grew up using no royal title at all, styled as Viscount Severn under the courtesy arrangement his parents chose at birth. Edward and Sophie made a deliberate decision to raise both of their children, James and his sister Louise, without the full weight of royal styling pressing down on them. They wanted their children to have the option of claiming their prince and princess entitlements at 18 if they chose to do so, but they were never going to push them toward it. James turned 18 and did not claim his prince title. According to royal watchers and family observers, he shows no interest in claiming it. But the legal fact of it remains live in every document connected to Edward's titles. Under the 1917 letters patent, James is automatically entitled to be styled as Prince James of Edinburgh with a style of Royal Highness. He has simply chosen not to use it. Royal legal documents, however, cannot simply ignore entitlements that exist. They must be listed, accounted for, and formally designated as active, officially cancelled, or held in reserve. Because Edward and Sophie never formally removed the entitlement, and critically, because they left that door deliberately open, the lawyers preparing documents around Edward's title structure must now account for James's prince entitlement in the paperwork, even though James himself wants nothing to do with it. This creates a legal complication that has no clean precedent in modern royal history. If James were ever to activate his prince title, he would hold a rank in the royal hierarchy that sits above a duke or an earl. His own father, as Duke of Edinburgh, would technically be outranked by his own son. The documents currently being written around Edward's estate and title succession would have to be restructured entirely to account for that reversal. The lawyers are essentially building new legal language from scratch, constructing careful frameworks to contain a scenario that nobody who drafted the 1917 legislation ever envisioned. The decision to structure the Dukedom of Edinburgh as a life peerage rather than a hereditary title was not made carelessly. King Charles had reasons, and royal biographer Robert Jobson, writing in his book Our King, Charles III, The Man and the Monarch Revealed, confirmed directly what those reasons were and what the plan behind them always involved. According to Jobson, King Charles had decided well before the 2023 announcement that Princess Charlotte, William's daughter, currently third in line to the throne, was the intended future recipient of the Dukedom of Edinburgh. As Jobson wrote, Charles had been careful to reserve one of the grandest titles for Princess Charlotte, and had made it clear Charlotte should become Duchess of Edinburgh after Edward dies. A senior palace source quoted by Jobson framed it explicitly in terms of the slimmed-down monarchy vision. The view inside the palace was that the Edinburgh Dukedom, as one of the most important titles in the royal family, should pass to senior members of the line of succession rather than to those on the edges. James, who by 2026 sits 16th in the line of succession, falls squarely into the category the palace described as those on the edges. The mechanism by which this plan works is precisely the life peerage structure. As confirmed across multiple verified royal sources, had Charles granted Edward a hereditary dukedom, the title would have passed to James upon Edward's death and then traveled down through James's descendants permanently. Charlotte would have had no path to it. By structuring it as a life peerage, Charles locked the title into Edward's hands for his lifetime and ensured that on Edward's death, it would return to the crown. At that point, William, as king or prince, would be free to grant it to Charlotte, most likely on her wedding day according to Jobson's reporting. The historical symmetry is not lost on royal observers. The Duchess of Edinburgh was the title held by Princess Elizabeth herself before she became queen in 1952. If Charlotte one day wears it, the title will have traveled from the woman who became Britain's longest-reigning monarch to the woman who may one day wear that same crown. The hat is the institution's vision. It is coherent, it is historically resonant, and by multiple accounts it reflects Charles's genuine desire to honor both his father's legacy and his granddaughter's future. But James did not factor into that vision. He was not a consideration in the architecture of that plan. He was, as the lawyer's documents now make unavoidably clear, the obstacle that had to be legally removed to make the architecture work. Royal sources have confirmed that Charles and his advisors decided the structure first, and Edward was informed of what he was receiving. After 24 years of waiting, with both parents dead, Edward had no real negotiating position. The choice available to him was a life peerage or nothing. He accepted it. He stood in public on his birthday and smiled. He said nothing about what it cost his son. The announcement did not come the moment Charles became king. The Times reported in July 2021 that Charles, then still Prince of Wales, had decided not to give Edward the Dukedom of Edinburgh. The promise Philip had publicly stated for over 2 decades appeared to be dying quietly with him. Clarence House issued no denial. According to reporting by Camilla Tominey in the Daily Telegraph, there were 2 significant concerns driving Charles's hesitation. The first was the slimmed-down monarchy. Palace advisors were pressing hard in a clear direction. Fewer senior titles, fewer working royals permanently embedded in the publicly funded royal structure. Granting a full hereditary dukedom to Edward cut directly against that strategy and would lock another branch of the family into senior status at exactly the moment Charles was trying to reduce it. The second concern was Scotland. In 2021, the Scottish independence movement was gathering serious momentum under Nicola Sturgeon's leadership. The Duke of Edinburgh title carries the name of Scotland's capital city. Tominey reported that concerns had been raised inside the palace that recreating this title at that political moment risked being read as the monarchy aggressively planting its flag in Scotland. Charles put the promise on hold. It was only after Nicola Sturgeon resigned in February 2023, breaking the immediate momentum of the independence campaign, that the political window cracked open. On the 10th of March 2023, Edward's 59th birthday, Charles made the announcement. The delay had cost Edward 2 years of waiting after his father's death and the full period of his mother's final months and death without resolution. What he received when the wait ended was a title structurally designed to serve the institution's long-term vision rather than his family's continuity. Through all of it, Sophie was the one keeping the family's royal function operational, and what the palace put her through in the process has never been examined with the attention it deserved. In 2001, the same year ardent St. Andrew's footage ended Edward's television career, Sophie was the target of one of the most calculated undercover media operations ever run against a working royal. A News of the World reporter spent months posing as a wealthy Middle Eastern businessman, slowly and systematically building Sophie's trust before secretly recording her private remarks. In those recordings, Sophie made candid comments about members of the royal family and about prominent public figures. When the recordings were published, Edward and Sophie issued a formal public apology. The humiliation was public and complete. But what almost no one focused on at the time was what else the reporter had been probing Sophie about during those same conversations, specifically about the palace's concerns over Edward's reputation and how the institution was managing narratives about her husband. A newspaper thought Edward's reputation was still a valuable enough target to warrant months of elaborate undercover work more than 2 years after his wedding. That fact tells you something about how alive those stories still were, and about the environment Sophie had walked into when she married him. She stayed. She absorbed it. She built a consistent, steady royal presence alongside Edward that the public eventually came to genuinely respect. Then in January 2020, Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties. In November 2021, Andrew was removed from public life following the Epstein scandal, a collapse so complete it stripped one of the most senior working royals from the institutional picture overnight. The working core of the monarchy contracted sharply. Edward and Sophie moved into the space left behind, without announcement and without any demand for recognition. More engagements, more international travel, more ceremonies attended, more of the essential quiet work of the institution carried out at a time when the royal family was under more sustained pressure than it had faced in a generation. People close to the palace described Sophie during this period as the most stabilizing presence within the institution. The return on all of that loyalty was a dukedom with a built-in expiration date, a son legally excluded from his grandfather's title before he had any voice in the matter, and a legal structure built above their heads that they were informed of but never meaningfully consulted on. Louise, their daughter, is at St. Andrews University and has been photographed working regular shifts at a garden center near her studies. No royal engagements, no public profile. James shows no interest in claiming the prince title that legally still belongs to him. Both children chose the path their parents modeled with their entire adult lives. Stay quiet. Carry nothing you do not have to carry. Do not let the institution see what it costs you. The legal clarity now sitting in Edward's title documents points in one direction, and it has been confirmed by multiple royal biographers and palace sources. When Edward dies, the dukedom of Edinburgh returns to the crown. William, at that point king or heir, will have the authority to grant it to Charlotte. According to Robert Jobson's reporting, the favored outcome as understood inside the palace is that Charlotte will receive the title on her wedding day, making her Duchess of Edinburgh in her own right. The historical weight of that outcome is genuine. The title would return to the female line for only the second time in its history. The first woman to hold it was Elizabeth herself, who was styled Duchess of Edinburgh from 1947 until her accession in 1952. If Charlotte receives it, she will carry a title once worn by the woman who defined the modern British monarchy across 7 decades. Charlotte is currently third in line to the throne and may one day wear the crown herself. A title built to honor the husband of a queen could, by this route, come to rest with another. Charles structured the entire chain deliberately. The life peerage was not an oversight or a bureaucratic compromise. It was the legal mechanism that made Charlotte's eventual inheritance possible. Without it, James would have been the automatic heir, and the title would have traveled down a branch of the family the palace had already decided sat outside the line it was protecting. James was 18 when all of this crystallized publicly. He now understands in full what was decided about him before he had any voice in it. He watched his uncle Andrew publicly destroyed and stripped of every role and title in real time. He watched Harry walk away from the institution and go to war with it from California. He watched the monarchy contract and harden around him throughout his entire childhood. And then he came of age and discovered that the title his grandfather had specifically and publicly wanted preserved for the family line had been legally routed around him before he was old enough to object. His silence is not acceptance. It is what the institution demands from people who have no power over decisions made above them. But that silence carries its own weight, and the lawyers working on Edward's documents are fully aware of what sits inside it. What Edward's legal team has now confirmed in writing is not a secret that was successfully kept. It is the formal documentation of something the palace had always hoped would remain unexamined. The double title structure, a life peerage sitting alongside hereditary earldoms in the same man's hands, triggering opposite outcomes at the moment of his death, has now been formally mapped in legal language. One title ends. One title passes on. The switch happens in a single instant. And the person standing on the receiving end of what passes through, the earldom of Wessex arriving in James's hands at the same moment the Edinburgh dukedom vanishes back into the crown, is an 18-year-old who never had a vote on any of it. The lawyers cannot resolve the underlying tension. They can build careful language around it. They can construct legal frameworks designed to contain scenarios that have no historical precedent. What they cannot do is make the fundamental reality of James's position disappear from the paperwork or from the public record. Edward accepted the structure he was given. He had no real choice. After 24 years of waiting, with both parents in the ground, there was no position from which to negotiate. What he accepted was a title carrying his father's name, held for life, passing nowhere when he is gone. What James receives instead is an earldom. Not the name his grandfather built. Not the title that traveled through 7 decades of royal service. An earldom. And the name his grandfather wanted to see continue through the family line goes to Charlotte, who was still in primary school when the palace quietly began building the legal architecture that would one day deliver it to her. The royal family is not in crisis in any visible, public sense. But the confirmation of this structure has done something the palace worked carefully to prevent. It has made the chain of decisions visible all at once. The delay after Philip's death, the Scottish independence calculation, the life peerage mechanism, the Charlotte destination, the James exclusion. None of these facts were hidden individually. Together, in a single documented legal framework, they tell a story about how power in the British royal family actually moves, who it protects, and who it passes over. Edward and Sophie built a family that survived everything the institution and the press threw at them across more than 2 decades. They paid for that survival in ways the palace will never formally acknowledge. The title that carries Philip's name belongs to Edward until he draws his last breath. Then it goes back to the crown. Then it goes to Charlotte. And the circle closes exactly as it was designed to close, not around Philip's bloodline, but around the line of succession.